Margaret Dawson often found herself staring at the large dining table in her home, wondering when it had last been filled with warmth and conversation. It used to be a place of laughter where her husband and son sat together, sharing meals and moments that made the house feel alive. But time had changed everything. Her husband had passed away years ago, and her son, Ethan, now fully grown and busy with his own career, rarely made it home before midnight. Margaret's life had slowly become an echo of routine, quiet mornings, long afternoons, and silent evenings spent in an empty house that once overflowed with life. She tried to stay busy. She cooked, cleaned, watered her plants, watched television, and read books, but none of these things could fill the quiet that settled heavily in the corners of her home. Even when the lights were on, the house felt dim, as if its brightness depended on the people inside it. Margaret often found herself looking toward the door, expecting someone to walk in, even though she knew no one would. One late afternoon, as she was preparing tea for herself, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and smiled slightly. It was Ethan. Though he did not call often, she always picked up with eagerness, hoping the conversation would be longer than usual. "Hi, Mom," Ethan said, sounding tired. "Long day?" Margaret asked, stirring her tea. "Like every day," he sighed. "Listen, I need a favor." Margaret felt a little spark of attention. At least he needed her for something. "What is it?" she asked softly. "Do you remember Lucas Miller? My friend from high school?" Margaret thought for a moment. Yes, she remembered Lucas, the boy who used to come over after school, the one who used to play video games in the living room with Ethan, laughing loudly, their shoes scattered near the couch. She had not seen him in years. "Yes, of course. Is he all right?" she asked. "Well," Ethan began, "he's moving back to the city. His new job is close to our area, but he hasn't found a place yet. I told him he could stay with us for a while, only temporarily. Is that okay?" Margaret blinked in surprise. Her quiet house was suddenly about to have someone walking through its halls again. Someone to cook for, talk to, share meals with. "Yes, that's fine," she replied gently. "When is he coming?" "Tonight," Ethan said. "He'll be there before I get home. I'll probably be late, so maybe just show him around." Margaret nodded, even though he couldn't see her. After hanging up, she stood still for a moment, taking in the change that was about to enter her life. She didn't know why she felt nervous, maybe because the loneliness she had quietly lived with was about to be interrupted. She prepared the guest room, dusted the windowsills, and changed the bedsheets. By the time the doorbell finally rang, evening had settled outside and the sky was dim. Margaret walked to the door with a calm smile, but when she opened it, she froze for a fraction of a second. Lucas was no longer the teenager she remembered. He stood tall, carrying a travel bag over one shoulder, his face more mature, his posture confident. Yet his eyes carried the same kindness she remembered. "Mrs. Dawson," he said warmly, smiling, "thank you so much for letting me stay." "Lucas," she replied, genuinely pleased. "My goodness, look at you. You've grown so much. Come in, come in." He stepped inside, and as he removed his shoes, he looked around the house with a nostalgic smile. "It's like nothing has changed," he said. "Many things have changed," Margaret replied softly, leading him inside. She showed him the guest room, offered him dinner, and he gratefully accepted. As she prepared food, Lucas helped set the table without being asked. Margaret noticed immediately Ethan never did that anymore. When they finally sat down for dinner, the silence that had become a regular visitor in the house suddenly disappeared. Lucas talked about his new job, the challenges of moving back to the city, memories from high school, and funny stories about Ethan growing up. Margaret found herself laughing in a way she hadn't in a long time. His presence filled the room with energy she didn't realize she had been missing. "So, how have you been, Mrs. Dawson?" Lucas asked as he took a sip of water. "Oh, she replied with a small smile, "staying busy, keeping the house going." "And Ethan?" Lucas asked. "Always working," Margaret answered, the sadness in her voice subtle but unmistakable. Lucas nodded, understanding. He remembered Ethan's ambitions, his determination, the way he always pushed himself to the next goal. It didn't surprise him that Ethan's work life had taken over everything else. When dinner ended, Lucas offered to wash the dishes. Margaret insisted on doing it herself, but he didn't listen. He stood beside her at the sink, rinsing plates while she dried them. For the first time in years, someone stood in that kitchen with her, sharing the simple, comforting routine of cleaning up after a meal. She found herself pausing now, and then quietly observing how naturally he moved, how politely he behaved, how considerate he was. Later, Lucas went to his room to settle in, and Margaret walked to her own bedroom. But she did not sleep immediately. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the quiet hallway through her open door. She couldn't explain why she felt different, but she did. There was life in the house again, footsteps, voices, a feeling of company. Even if only temporary, it felt like a piece of something she thought she had lost finally returned. Margaret lay down, turning off the lamp beside her. The room remained dark, but inside her, something warm flickered to life. She didn't know what would happen next, nor did she think anything unusual or dramatic was coming. She was simply grateful that her home wasn't silent tonight. For the first time in a long while, the house and her heart did not feel so empty. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the house changed in a way Margaret had never expected. Lucas settled in comfortably, waking early every morning, helping himself to breakfast, and often preparing an extra cup of tea for Margaret when she walked into the kitchen. She found herself smiling before she even reached the stove, something she had not done in years. She had spent so long alone that she had forgotten how pleasant it felt to have someone greet her in the morning. Lucas filled the house with the simple sounds of daily life, opening cabinets, pouring cereal, humming softly as he checked emails at the dining table. Sounds that had once been ordinary now felt precious. Margaret realized how much she had missed the presence of another human being in the house. Ethan continued to come home late, barely exchanging more than a handful of words with his mother before disappearing to his room or falling asleep on the sofa. When he did interact, he mostly talked about deadlines, work pressure, presentations, or client meetings. Margaret listened patiently, but she noticed Lucas listening too. Often with a look that said more than words, he could see the distance growing between Ethan and his mother. One evening, Ethan left for a 3-day work trip, apologizing quickly before rushing out the front door with his laptop bag. Lucas remained in the living room, watching Margaret close the door behind her son with a quiet expression. She stood still for a moment before turning to return to the kitchen, trying not to look as tired as she felt. Lucas noticed. "Everything all right?" he asked gently. Margaret forced a smile. "He's busy. His job demands a lot. I'm used to it by now." Lucas walked closer. "You don't have to be used to being alone." Margaret froze at the honesty of the sentence. She looked at him, trying to keep her emotions from showing. It had been so long since anyone had acknowledged that she might need something too. Most people assumed mothers simply endured whatever life handed them without complaint. "Would you like some tea?" she asked quietly, shifting the conversation away from her emotions. Lucas nodded, understanding that she needed space, but he stayed near the kitchen doorway while she boiled water and reached for the cups. That night, instead of sitting alone watching television, Margaret found herself sharing tea with Lucas at the dining table. At first, they spoke about small things, recipes, the weather, the changes in the neighborhood. But slowly their conversation deepened, guided not by intention, but by the comfort of having someone who listened. Margaret spoke about her late husband, how hard it had been to hold everything together after he passed, and how Ethan had thrown himself into academics, then career, leaving little time for anything else. Lucas listened quietly, nodding without interrupting. He did not try to offer advice or solutions. He simply heard her. And that alone was something she had desperately needed. "I thought things would get easier with time," Margaret said softly, her eyes distant. "But sometimes I feel like the older I get, the quieter life becomes. I miss conversations. I miss feeling seen." Lucas leaned forward slightly. "You deserve to be seen." She looked up, surprised at the sincerity in his voice. For a moment, she forgot that he was her son's friend. He wasn't speaking as a young man comforting an older woman. He was speaking as someone who truly understood loneliness. Lucas then told her about his own life. He had grown up in a complicated home with divorced parents who rarely attended his school events. When he was younger, he spent more time at the Dawson house than anywhere else because he felt more welcome there. Margaret had always treated him kindly, offering him snacks, asking about his grades, and cheering him on in small ways. He told her he had never forgotten that kindness. Margaret listened in silence, realizing for the first time how much her small gestures had meant to him. That night, long after their teacups were empty, neither of them moved to end the conversation. They talked about dreams, regrets, unfulfilled wishes, and the strange paths that life takes people down. When Margaret finally stood to say goodnight, she realized she didn't want the evening to end. She walked to her room with a feeling she hadn't felt in years, a warmth in her chest, not romantic, but deeply human. Someone had finally seen her, and in being seen, she felt alive again. The next day continued with the same unexpected comfort. Lucas helped clean the yard, laughed while struggling to trim a stubborn branch, and Margaret found herself standing on the porch, smiling at the sight. She felt a quiet joy, watching someone put care into the home again. Later that afternoon, they shared lunch together. Lucas complimented her cooking, and she felt her heart lift the way it used to whenever her husband used to praise her meals. She had forgotten how good appreciation felt. That evening, as rain tapped softly against the windows, Lucas sat reading in the living room while Margaret knitted beside him. The silence between them was not empty. It was the kind of silence shared by people who feel comfortable around one another. It was peaceful, tender, and safe. But as the days passed, something else began to settle inside Margaret, an awareness she did not want to admit. She caught herself waiting for Lucas to wake up in the mornings, listening for footsteps in the hallway, looking forward to conversations at dinner. She found herself thinking about whether her hair looked neat before walking into the living room. These small details were things she had stopped caring about long ago. One night, after Lucas had gone to bed, Margaret stood in front of her bathroom mirror, staring at her own reflection. She didn't see a young woman. She saw someone older, someone who had been exhausted by life, but still wanted to feel something again. She pressed her hands against the sink, recognizing the emotions she was trying to hide. "This is not right," she whispered to herself. "He is Ethan's friend." She turned off the light and walked toward the bedroom, but sleep didn't come easily. Her heart was conflicted. Not because Lucas had done anything wrong, he had been nothing but respectful, but because she could no longer deny that something inside her had awakened. She was lonely, desperately lonely, and Lucas's presence reminded her of everything she had been missing. She closed her eyes and took a slow breath, hoping these feelings would fade. She had no intention of acting on them. She simply wished she didn't feel them at all. But loneliness has a way of finding cracks in even the strongest walls, and Margaret had been living with cracks for far too long. Outside, rain continued falling softly against the windows, as if the house itself understood her pain, but had no way to carry it for her. 3 days passed, and by the time Ethan returned home from his work trip, the quiet understanding between Margaret and Lucas had grown deeper. Nothing inappropriate happened. There were only shared conversations, small routines, and the simple comfort of two human beings who understood loneliness in different ways. Still, the connection was real, and Margaret felt its weight in her chest. Ethan walked into the house late at night, his tie loosened and exhaustion on his face. Lucas was sitting in the living room, finishing a cup of tea while reading a report for work. Margaret stepped out of the kitchen just as Ethan appeared. "Hey," Ethan said, setting his laptop bag down. "How's everything here?" Lucas stood politely. "Good. Your mom has been taking great care of me." Margaret smiled softly. "He's settled in well. How was your trip?" Ethan shrugged. "Same as always. Meetings, presentations, stress. I'm just glad it's over." He walked toward the kitchen, barely noticing how tired Margaret looked. Lucas noticed, though. Even in silence, he saw everything. A little later, Ethan excused himself and went to bed. Margaret closed the kitchen light and paused near the dining table. Lucas stood a few feet away, hesitating before speaking. "Good night, Mrs. Dawson," he said gently. She nodded, but her heart felt heavier than it should have. She didn't understand why Ethan's return made the house feel full and empty at the same time. She went upstairs and lay in bed, listening to the familiar silence return. Ethan's presence should have comforted her. But instead, she felt forgotten again. It stung more than usual because now she had tasted what it felt like to matter. The next day, the house shifted back to its old rhythm. Ethan left early for work, not bothering with breakfast, barely looking up from his phone. Margaret stood at the counter, pouring coffee, feeling more invisible than ever. Lucas walked in, noticing immediately. "Rough morning?" he asked softly. Margaret forced a small laugh. "Every morning is a rough morning when you live with a ghost." Lucas's expression softened. He looked down, unsure whether he should say more. "You deserve better from him," he finally murmured. Margaret didn't respond. She just sat down, sipping her coffee in silence. She knew Lucas was right. Ethan was so consumed by his own life that he had stopped noticing hers. As the afternoon turned into evening, Ethan called to say he would not be home for dinner. Margaret listened without surprise, but Lucas caught the flicker of disappointment in her eyes. "Would you like company for dinner?" he asked kindly. She nodded, grateful. They cooked together, nothing fancy, just simple vegetables and rice, but the kitchen felt warm, alive. They laughed while trying not to burn the garlic, and Margaret realized how long it had been since laughter came easily in her kitchen. When they sat down to eat, she looked across the table and wondered how someone who wasn't family could make her feel more seen than her own son. But that thought troubled her, too. Later that night, Ethan returned home unexpectedly early. He walked into the living room and stopped when he saw Lucas and Margaret sitting close together, deep in conversation. They weren't touching, but the emotional closeness was undeniable. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice neutral but sharp. Lucas stood immediately. "Nothing. We were just talking." Ethan didn't buy it. "I leave for a few days, and suddenly the house feels different." Margaret stepped forward. "Ethan, don't make this something it isn't." But even as she spoke, she felt her heart tighten. For the first time, she wondered how this situation must look from the outside. Ethan started questioning Lucas about job plans and how long he intended to stay. The tension in the room grew heavier by the second. Lucas answered politely, but Margaret could feel something shifting. With Ethan home again, the delicate balance that had formed was unraveling. Later, Ethan disappeared upstairs, and Lucas stood in the hallway with a pained expression. "I think maybe it's time I start looking for another place," he said quietly. Margaret's breath caught. She wanted to tell him that wasn't necessary, that he had done nothing wrong, that the house was better when he was here. But she also knew he was right. If he stayed, things could grow messy, not because of anything improper happening, but because emotions have a way of creating consequences even when actions do not. Margaret walked to the sofa and sat down slowly. Lucas remained standing, hands in his pockets, as if unsure whether he should say more. "You've been kind to me," Lucas said gently. "More than you know. But I don't want to cause discomfort in your home." His words struck her deeply. She looked up at him, her eyes heavy with unspoken truth. "You haven't caused anything. Life just becomes complicated when feelings enter the wrong places." Lucas understood instantly. He swallowed hard, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, not with longing, but with the quiet ache of two people who recognized something they could not allow. The next morning, Lucas packed his small bag. Margaret made breakfast, moving quietly around the kitchen, trying to keep her emotions under control. She wanted to say something meaningful, something that explained how he had changed the silence of her life, but every sentence dissolved before reaching her mouth. Lucas walked toward the front door with her. He turned around one last time. "I hope you find the happiness you deserve," he said softly. Margaret blinked back tears. "And I hope your new life brings you people who appreciate you." Lucas hesitated, then stepped forward and hugged her briefly. Not a romantic embrace, but one filled with gratitude, respect, and unspoken understanding. When he stepped back, he gave her a small smile. "Goodbye, Mrs. Dawson." She nodded. "Goodbye, Lucas." She watched him walk down the driveway and disappear around the corner. The house felt heavier than before, not because he had been there, but because now he was gone. She closed the door and leaned against it, letting out a slow breath she had been holding for days. That evening, Ethan noticed the quiet look in his mother's eyes. For the first time in a long while, he paused and really looked at her. "Mom," he said gently, "are you okay?" Margaret turned toward him. "I've been alone for a long time, Ethan. I just didn't realize how deeply until someone reminded me what company feels like." Ethan wasn't defensive this time. He lowered his gaze, ashamed. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I should be here more. I didn't realize how much I've taken for granted." Margaret nodded, accepting his apology. She didn't need him to feel guilty. She needed him to understand. In the weeks that followed, things began to change. Ethan started having dinner at home again. They talked more, shared small daily details, and slowly rebuilt the connection that had faded over time. Margaret didn't forget Lucas. She remembered him with respect and gratitude. He had walked into her life and reminded her that she was still capable of feeling, still worthy of being seen, still holding a heart that had not yet grown cold. She didn't regret what had happened, not because anything romantic occurred, but because the experience awakened a truth she had avoided. Loneliness can make a person believe their story is already over, but sometimes a brief connection, no matter how unexpected, can remind them that they still have chapters left to write. Margaret began writing hers anew.